As you guys open up your notebooks to page 23, that one thing that we've covered so far in all of this stuff about the reliability of the Bible is covered really well in Greg Gilbert's little tiny book, Why Trust the Bible. He basically he basically has the same approach to that question as I did, as I looked at the reliability of the Bible and has walked you through those steps. If you ever like want to cement or like go through like what was Gary talking about when he was talking about that, Greg Gilbert just does it his own way. He tries to take you through the exact same journey, the exact
about the real problem passages that we're aware of. And we should be honest that we're aware of them, that they are problem passages. Now, has the apostles' message overall been reliably preserved as it's been copied through the centuries? Here's the question, and I like phrasing it like this. Do we still have the Old Testament that Jesus endorsed? Do we still have the Old Testament that Jesus endorsed? We would say yes, of course.
The Jews would have protected it.
But what is the, I guess if I took you to the back room of the museum, and I would like show you, why do the scholars say that? Why do the teachers say that? Oh yeah, we do. We have the Bible that Jesus endorsed. We have the Old Testament that Jesus. How do they come to such confidence? Have you guys ever gone through that question on your own?
Yeah.
Not really, but it comes up to the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, you've heard of this?
Yeah.
You've heard of the Dead Sea
Yeah.
Scrolls and how they're used to answer this question.
Right.
But the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves are nothing special. I mean, the Essenes, who probably wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, were heretics, and they're nobody like, oh, we should really read the Dead Sea Scrolls because there's really important spiritual information. No, the Essenes were probably wackos. They're probably really crazy people, and they also like to copy the Old Testament. Now we'll get into this, how this relates to my question. But how have you heard this gone through and being answered?
Well, yeah, just Dead Sea Scrolls.
Something about the Dead Sea
Yeah.
Scrolls.
Mhm.
Now, what about the Dead Sea Scrolls?
It validates the Bible.
How? Is that Rhonda?
Yeah, I think so. She's good.
Sorry, Rhonda.
No, you're fine.
Thank you.
Well, is it that if you have this old text and matches with the current text, it kind of validates the lineage?
Yes. What's the current text you just talked about there?
I'm not sure
Okay. So that's just the steps we gotta take. We gotta figure out what Travis was talking about, and then that's the steps we take. So, what are the Dead Sea Scrolls and why are they important? Here's the shortest answer. The shortest answer is that if you go to the Jerusalem Museum today, you can see in a special presentation all of these preserved written manuscripts of, and this one is in centerpiece, but around the room they have other Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts. And manuscript will now on just be a term meaning handwritten. That's what manuscript is. All right, so on these papers are handwritten copies of the book of Isaiah. And the book of Isaiah is the only book from the Old Testament that's completely copied, every word, by the guys who did the Dead Sea Scrolls, the wackos, the Essenes. So if you go and look at this, you can actually look at these ancient manuscripts that are older than Jesus. So these were physically made probably 200 years before Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And that's going to be important. Now, by the way, this is really cool. This came out not too long ago. It's finally the case. This came out. This is an English translation of all these things in the room and in their back room. And it's not complete. This is not the complete Old Testament because they don't have all of the Old Testament in their manuscripts. But Isaiah is complete. So I have read most of Isaiah in this English translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then you can go and read another Isaiah and just compare the two. And I'll let you guys look at that as we go around. But here's what Travis was talking about. And I just put this is all from a Dr. Wegner, Paul Wegner, from Phoenix Seminary, King's College, the University of London. And this is what all this complicated text says. He says the oldest Hebrew manuscripts, like we're talking about the paper, the manuscripts that the Hebrew was on, of a complete Old Testament, goes only back to like 1008 AD. That's 1,000 years after Jesus rose from the dead. Or there's another one called the Aleppo Codex, and that's a manuscript of the complete Old Testament from 930 AD. So before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the oldest manuscripts only go back to the Crusades, the medieval times. So in the 1940s, when these Hebrew Old Testament scholars found the Dead Sea Scrolls, now they were very, very curious. Were the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were about 1,200 years earlier than their oldest manuscripts, were they going to be different? Now, their best case was Isaiah. Isaiah, because it was complete, and these texts were complete. And so they were like, let's compare it. And this is what they said. This tradition was maintained by the Masoretes, these are those guys, and when compared to the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts dated about 1,000 years earlier, was found to be like very accurate. And you can even now, thanks to the English translations, you can get an English translation of the Old Testament, which is mostly based on these manuscripts. And you can take the Dead Sea Scrolls, Isaiah, and just literally compare them to. And they're not significantly different at all. So the conclusion is what, Travis?
There's continuity between.
There's continuity, at least between Isaiah, and then if there was continuity, like 99% continuity with Isaiah, what's the chances that the other books, if we would have had them, would have this similar continuity? It's strong, right?
Yeah, you
it's
expect
probable.
they're gonna have the same
It's
pattern.
plausible. So that's why the 1940s were so exciting for the Dead Sea Scrolls, and scholars have been working on that ever since, because they're just simply trying to say how accurate were these late codexes or these late manuscripts. How accurate were they? At least compared to something 1,000 years earlier. And that's it. And that's what it is. So what are the Dead Sea Scrolls and why are they important? Can you guys try to put that in your own words? And it has something to do with Travis was just talking about comparing them to these manuscripts.
Verification.
Yeah, exactly. It's just doing old thought.
So how many people who were scholars who weren't Christians became Christians because of the Dead Sea Scrolls? That's would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing in the Dead Sea Scrolls that is particularly.
No,
Like-
but it's just the verification to realize.
Yeah, but I
they
mean,
matched
ultimately
up.
it's just verifying the Old Testament. Do we have the Old Testament that was around, in the first century of Roman Empire? Do we have that Old Testament? Yeah, we have continuity to such a high degree that's most likely the case. And that's not saying anything about the divinity of Jesus. That's not saying anything about whether or not he's the Son of God or the Son of Man. Just like, do we have the actual words that Jesus read? Well, at least 99% of them. To a degree that we're like, very, very probable.
But doesn't there also, like, people who were saying that, like, when Jesus died on the cross, that was prophesied in Isaiah.
Yeah.
And so then you have this flow of, okay, this wasn't, like, they weren't saying, oh, this was something that was prophesied. Now they can look back at the Dead Sea Scrolls. They've proven that this was around before Jesus was even.
The only thing with that is they already had Greek translations and Greek manuscripts showing that's the case. Now there's translations that were proving the case, but now it's the Hebrew manuscripts that now can do the exact same thing. But we already had that, yeah. Because there's Septuagint goes back to 250 BC, and there was, copies and sections
from, like,
of
Daniel and
yeah,
Isaiah and all of them.
yeah, of all those kind of things. But it is interesting. It's about now an interpretation issue. In the middle of Jerusalem today, in Jerusalem's museum, they are preserving the oldest Hebrew paper that has the suffering servant text on it, and they're there. Mm-hmm. And if I could read Hebrew from the first century, I could go find it and read that passage. Now that's an interpretation issue for the rest of the people in Jerusalem right now. It's like, oh, isn't that interesting? You're preserving the suffering servant issue. Yeah, but it's not really talking about Jesus, is what they'd say.
Right.
But for myself, who does believe that it's talking about Jesus, it's interesting. They preserved one of the most key passages in the Old Testament for a Christian. Yeah. And that's the suffering servant passage.
But on that next slide with the codexes,
yeah,
are those are like Hebrew?
Yeah, those are Hebrew codexes.
So that's an original, not a Greek translation
exactly.
copy.
Correct.
Okay.
So the oldest Hebrew manuscripts We're only going back to the Crusades,
Okay.
before the Dead Sea
Well, we
Scrolls.
have consistency in the translations with the Greeks.
Ah, yeah, but then you get to play translation games.
Uh-huh.
And then it gets always a little more like frustrating and not as certain, because you get translation games of all that. But these are just all Hebrew.
And
All
was
Hebrew.
that Leningrad? Is that in Leningrad?
Yeah, exactly.
Russia?
hmm
Okay.
Yeah,
It's what?
it's in Russia today, Leningrad, Russia.
How come Russia has it?
It's because their scholars preserved it, and they are paying the
So
money for the air conditioning.
So the one that's from 1008 is in Russia.
That one's in Russia. I'm not sure where the Aleppo Codex
I think that's
is
in the
currently
Middle East.
residing.
That sounds Greek.
Like,
Well,
we always hear
yeah.
about, like in the Gulf War, there was Aleppo.
Oh,
yeah.
that's
I
what
think
it
it's in
was.
Iraq.
Yeah,
someplace.
but they don't have the air conditioning capabilities. I don't know it could even like the British Museum got a
Well,
lot of
then-
these.
10-8, they didn't have air conditioning either.
No, I know that. No, I'm just saying that's
Preserve it.
that's when that paper's from. The paper of that Leningrad Codex
So
is
that
from
didn't
10.
get destroyed in World War II, it could have.
Nope. Yep. So they were able to preserve
kept it.
a lot of those.
They probably put it underground.
But remember, Russia wasn't bombed a lot in World War II, so it was good thing it wasn't in Poland or South Germany.
Maybe that's why.
Well, let's go. All right, let's get to some. Okay, so you guys can. By the way, you can get that book for yourself and just compare the Isaiahs and see what you think. All right, now let's talk about the New Testament. Do we still have the New Testament that Jesus authorized? And what is New Testament textual criticism? That's the next question on page 23.
So how could he authorize it?
What?
It wasn't written when he was alive, so
Correct.
how could he authorize it?
What do you mean? He did it with his mouth.
What Jesus authorized in John
14.
when he told them that I will bring to mind everything that I've told you. And
Yeah.
That's what you mean by authorize?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
He authorized it before he
And
died.
and ultimately, all the apostles agree that they're fulfilling what Jesus is wanting them to do when they make stories about Jesus.
He foretold stuff.
Yeah. Now, if we wanted paper, the oldest paper with New Testament on it is being argued about right now, and we're looking at it. It's called Papyrus 52, and it has a little tiny verse sections from John 18. But the paper itself, they're really arguing about right now. There's scholars going at it right this second in museums around the world, and they think this paper right here, that might be going back to 150 AD, which, in the terms of manuscripts, is going to be the oldest possible. The oldest possible. And just for reference, the manuscripts that my New Testament really relies on and is like saying, oh, this is the best manuscripts, will only go to about 350 AD. The paper of those manuscripts goes to about 350 AD. So when they find these little scraps of paper with the New Testament on it, some of it's much older than 350, but how old can they get it? This is the one they're arguing about right now, and there's no certainty. And we know the reason why there's no certainty is because the way you date these things is by understanding the development of penmanship. And that is a really subjective scholarly endeavor. So they're really arguing about, like, when did the Delta start looking like that? And they well, the Delta starts changing around 250 AD. That's not the Delta of that time period.
So
So,
where did they find that?
good question. I think it's probably in Egypt,
That's what-
and it's in the sands of some throwaway material of like the Nag Hammadi collection, and then the British Museum and other scholars then like suck these things up, take them back to their museums, first protect the paper, do everything they can to protect the paper, and then they argue about how old is that paper. And a lot of it just comes down to subjective.
And how long
Kinda
have they been
sciences.
debating about this?
Good question. I'd have to just quickly Google that. How long has the Papyrus 52 been around in museums? Obviously, it was around for a long, long time. But when did they first start getting it into a museum and start arguing about it?
I got a question.
Yes.
Couldn't they do a carbon dating on
Yeah,
that paper?
of course. But as carbon dating will always show, it'll give you a range of possibilities. And you're talking about centuries of possibilities. So
Yeah, but-
whether it's 149 AD or 150 AD, you'll never get from carbon dating whatsoever.
Right. Well, you would think that back then, they couldn't actually keep paper very long like we do now.
Yeah, yeah. In the cool thing is, like, in the dry sands of the Middle East, there wasn't a lot of moisture that would allow funguses and allow some insects kind of to thrive. So that's why we get most
Yeah.
of our really, really old paper
Okay.
from the Middle East. But yeah,
You think they'll ever find something in China in a desert like that?
maybe in the desert.
Yeah,
Possibly.
in a deserty area of China.
Yeah, you
That'd
just
be cool.
it's just you gotta keep that moisture away. It's the moisture that breeds all the bugs and fun stuff.
But given
Won't find
the
anything here.
proposed date of that, right?
Yeah, that's a very,
not
very
saying
old
that
date.
was the only thing they had written, it's just the only thing that survived. There must have been.
We're just talking
earlier
about
ones.
paper. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the oldest piece of paper that might be around in a museum today. But of course, there's other things. There still has things that haven't been found yet. They might even be
They
older.
need to find the Kindles they had back then.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. All right, but let's be honest, and you should be honest with a non-Christian too. When it comes to the 27 books, the original 27 books have disappeared, most likely due to moisture.
Yeah.
And we're talking about the paper themselves that John Mark wrote on is no longer with us.
Yeah.
It's not. It's gone, and it's probably been gone within decades of their composition. So you're thinking like 150 AD. That still has to be a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. But could we ever get back to the first copy? Probably not. You guys know what? Paper will not survive. The ink won't survive. So we've got to be honest with everybody that the handwritten copies or manuscripts must be relied on to determine the wording of the original text. And yet, here's the other thing you should be honest about. No two manuscripts are exactly alike. And even the closest two early manuscripts have at least half a dozen differences per chapter. Most of them are inconsequential variations. And what I mean by that, by definition, is they're talking about prepositions. So go back to your grammar days, and they're like, oh, let's argue over this preposition. Let's argue over this conjunction. Yeah, there's a lot of variations. Yeah, exactly. And there are Bible college kids who do this for fun in libraries. They'll get into the details, and I'm afraid the details are about prepositions and conjunctions. Articles, definite articles, indefinite articles, all this kind of thing. So let's just be honest. The discipline known as New Testament textual criticism is thus needed because of these two facts: disappearance of the originals and the disagreements among the manuscripts. If anybody wants to say, well, the Holy Spirit preserved the New Testament manuscripts because God just didn't want any of the message to be lost, I'm afraid that's not honest. That's not honest. All of the manuscripts that we get, they have variations. They do. Every single manuscript has a variation. You shouldn't lie about that fact. So, can I show you guys on page 24 how New Testament textual criticism actually works and the kind of things I did in Bible college to understand how we can confidently say that we have the New Testament the Jews authorized of all that. Okay, so what are we looking at here? We are looking at a page of the Nestle Allen 27th edition of the New Testament Greek. Now, since I've been to Bible college, they've come out with a 28th edition.
Is it much different?
No. Like now, from here on out, after the 27th, we're talking about the differences between the 28th and possibly the 29th. It's going to be so narrow of a difference. It's going to be small changes from here on out. So what did they do? They took all the different manuscripts of, what are we looking at? Oh, we're looking at the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, verses 8 through 18. All the numbers match up, like all the verses would match up like in your English Bible. And they're taking all of that, and they try to put their best guess of what belongs up here and what belongs down here. And that's what New Testament textual criticism is all about. So let's give you guys a blown up example here.
Can I ask, when do they put in chapters and verses?
You got, I always learn it and I'm like, I need to remember that. You're looking at monks in monasteries in the time of the Crusades.
Okay.
Had started to put versifications in there, and then by the time the printing press comes along in 1453, they're just going along with what's been the case for probably about 200, 300 years.
Okay.
So it's the printing press that ultimately solidifies the versification. Nobody really plays with the versification after the printing press. But before that, it was still just kind of like an art, and the monks were leading that art.
And they just did it to break it out.
Yeah, because they
by
had to break
thoughts?
up their readings and their, they read and pray through the entire Bible every single year. So, so the abbot could say, this is what we're all reading on Monday. So it's just simply as a clerical
And at some
clerical
point they
business.
were traveling, and every time he hit a bump, he was like, "Well, there's the break." That's what my professor told me.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's no, there is rhyme or reason, but yeah.
There is, but
Yeah, but it's definitely should never control interpretation.
Yeah.
And they they ended the chapter right here, so they must have ended the chapter right here on purpose. No, nobody ended the chapter right there. This is all added later, just for monks to be all on the same literal page. All that. I forgot the exact date. I gotta go look that up again and just Google that. All right, so let's check this out. If you guys look with me on page 24, can you find the number 13?
yeah.
All right, so where it goes from 13 to 14, which is right underneath that line that I drew by my hand on there. This is what it actually says. This is what it actually says, but in Greek. It says, and Jesus goes up on the mountain and summons whom he was wanting, and they went to him. And Jesus appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, in order that they might be with him, and in order that he might send them out to proclaim. Now, if you ever want to get geeky with me and go, oh, I recognize some of these Greek words, I can point out whichever one, because one of the coolest things about I got from Bible college is we had to read through the Gospel of Mark in Greek, and then I wasn't very good at it, so I spent the next 25 years just kind of practicing only the Gospel of Mark, though, because I've really only worked on that since Bible college to kind of make up for my poor student days. All right, so if you do recognize any Greek words, I can point them out to you. But do you guys believe me? This is just what that says in Greek?
It's Greek
All right.
to me.
It's just Greek to you? Yeah, exactly. And all that.
I'm going to trust you.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to just trust me on that. So what we had to then learn using this Nestle Allen 27th edition is that they add a whole bunch of other little marks in there. And so I just want you guys to notice there's this mark right there. Do you guys see all that mark?
Yeah.
Yeah. That tells me to look down at the bottom of the page. And if you guys look at it, you find it right about here in verse 14, that same mark. So the versification is the same when you have a verse up here. The number for the verse goes down there. And then it's a whole bunch of jargon. Just jargon. It's basically you learn a little language of what does that symbol mean? And then when you go find that symbol, what does all that jargon after that symbol mean? And that's what we did for class sometimes. So I was very interested in this passage because right here, what this says right here is that in some manuscripts, specifically this one, in some manuscripts, right there where that symbol is the word disciples. So in some manuscripts it says, and he appointed 12 disciples, whom he sent, who he named apostles in order that he might send them out and they might be with him and all that. All right, so this manuscript right there, which you just have to there's a whole decoder ring on what that W means. That manuscript, in their verses, the word disciple says there. Now, what's really interesting is there's also this symbol, and that symbol takes me to this jargon right here. And it says those words, 1, 2, 3, 4 words, in between those brackets, guess what? Is not there in some of these manuscripts that they list right here. But then they're going to list in all this jargon the manuscripts that do have those words. Now, I was always interested in this particular passage, and here's why. What I'm trying to say here is that some of the manuscripts, if you were to translate them in English, look like this. And he goes up on the mountain and summons whom he was wanting, and they went to him, and he appointed 12 disciples in order that they might be with him, in order that he might send them out to proclaim. Now, for someone who believes the New Testament is the apostles' message, this is the first time in history the word is used, apostles. And some manuscripts don't have it. Some manuscripts do. So it made me really wonder which Mark 3:13 through 14 is Mark's, the Gospel of Mark, of all that. Now, do you guys realize the vast majority of these textual criticism questions are not even close to being this exciting, and you're not even excited right now.
I want to know why do they have disciples and then apostles? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, some appointed 12 disciples,
Yeah, why
and then some do not have this phrase, whom he also named
so
apostles.
why do they have both?
Yeah. I was curious about that.
Is one an Old Testament, New Testament?
No. Yeah, exactly.
Or is it 1,000 years later in the first
yeah.
century? Or
Yeah.
Okay.
The vast majority of these differentiations are about prepositions, conjunctions, articles, and if you get into the details on any other verses, it gets even more boring. This is one of the most exciting ones I could find to ask this question: which verse is the original one, and all that.
Disciples sounds like something Jesus did. Apostles sounds like a Christian appointed that name.
Oh, you think so?
Like it's liturgical or something.
All right. So guess what? To take all the exciting verses, this came out about 50 years ago, 60 years ago. They came out with this. Bruce Metzger, who was a scholar at Princeton for a long time, he finally put together this kind of go-to manual for all the exciting differences. And anytime there's a real exciting difference, you can look it up in here. If it's not exciting, then it doesn't get in here. It's just all the nerds have to argue out over which preposition did Jesus most likely use or something like that. So guess what? This particular verse ends up in here. And then sadly, Bruce uses a whole bunch of crazy long words for this. He says, although these words right here, which he named apostles is what it says there right there. Although those words, which he appointed as apostles, may be regarded as an interpolation from Luke, the committee that put this book together was of the opinion that the external evidence is too strong in their favor to warrant their ejection from the text. In order to reflect the balance of probabilities, the words were retained but enclosed within the square brackets. All right, all that doing to say is that if you can make it through Bruce's ultra technical language, this is what he's saying. He's like, hey, Luke 6:13 has this exact same phrase, and there are no manuscript differences with this. There's not a single manuscript that doesn't have this phrase in Luke.
That was just copying Mark.
Exactly. So that's a very high probability case. So if there is no question that this was in Luke 6:13, and Luke was copying from Mark, do you think this was in Mark? That's what Bruce said.
Yeah.
That's what Bruce said. He said probably, but because we're not for sure, let's put brackets around it.
Yeah.
That's all he did. That's all he did, and that makes sense to me. But that's how they kind of wade through every single one of these exciting differences, and then they make a scholarly declaration, and they're like, we're not sure.
So is this exactly what they did when you read John with the adulterous woman, and it's in brackets, and they're like,
But these are different brackets.
It is different brackets.
These
but
are-
not all translations will have that.
Exactly. These are Nestle Allen jargon, little message code work. And if you want to learn a little code work, yeah, they use brackets. But those aren't the exact same brackets that are saying the exact same thing in your English translation. Does that make sense?
So like,
But it's like it. It's similar to it.
so like you have, in the liturgy, you have the Apostles' Creed. We've never had the Disciples' Creed. It's always been the Apostles' Creed. You know,
Yeah, I mean, let's
we-
talk about that later, Tony, about
Yeah,
the
sure.
actual. But here's what I can tell you: is there is no manuscript difference in Luke 6:13. It uses the word apostles in this exact same pericope, this exact same episode. He uses the word whom he also named apostles. There is no manuscript changes for Luke 6:13. All the manuscripts say that.
Well, didn't Mark learn from Luke? Or
No,
Luke
it was the other way around.
Was it?
Yeah,
Mark was before.
Mark was before Luke.
Yeah.
John
Did Mark get killed?
Yes.
Did
No, Mark did not
I thought-
immediately or anything like that. No.
But I mean, he died sooner than Luke. Maybe. I don't know.
I mean, there's lots of questions about John Mark's eventual future, like career and what he actually did. All right, so that's just the kind of exciting work that they do in this kind of like New Testament textual criticism. That's what it does. And if you find an exciting variation, they'll cover it in this scholarly text. All right, so now. Here's where we need to be honest about. Oh, by the way, before we move on, I did do a look on like what different modern day versions do with this textual thing. And this is interesting. This is how the NIV wrote it. Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him, and he appointed 12. Footnote A, that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. And then you have to go to the very bottom of the NIV page, and it says, some manuscripts say 12, designating them apostles. But you know what? I don't think that should be a footnote. I think it actually should be in the text, which is what the King James Version does, and it's what the ESV version does. It includes that phrase, but the interesting, the ESV chose to put it in parentheses, and there are no parentheses in the Greek text. There's no parentheses there, but I think that way is my preference. If I was on a scholarly committee, like what do we do with Mark 14? I would do it that way. Okay, but that's what they do when they're doing all this. Now, you guys ready to talk about the big question, which you actually brought up? Did you know this is the bracket you were talking about, Rhonda? That there are big questions to be honest about, and one of them is Mark 16, 9 through 20, which has special English translation brackets, and then John 7:53, if you look in your Bible, has brackets around it. What do those brackets mean, and what should we be honest about when it comes to those brackets? Now, do you have Bibles, or do you want me to just tell you what these passages are about, the contents of those passages?
The second one is the woman caught in adultery.
The woman caught in adultery is this one. And it is a big question that we should be honest about. Have you guys seen the brackets on Mark 16, 9 through 20?
I don't think mine had that.
One of the oldest manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark It's called the Vaticanus manuscript, and it goes back to the 300s. It ends right here, and it says Ephobun Togar, and that's the actual words at the end of Mark 16:8. So one of the oldest pieces of paper that we have with the ending of Mark actually ends at 8, verse 8 right there. And that's what the rest of the page looks like. And that just says, according to Mark. And that's what the page looks like. It just ends at verse 8.
But then there's other manuscripts that they found that have 9 through 20. Is that all it says?
This is just the manuscript.
Yeah.
Yeah, of all that. So, these are two of the most exciting passages, and to be honest about. And so guess who covers these passages? This right here. So, what they say in this commentary right here is that looking at all the evidence, guess what? It probably ended at verse 8.
Oh, that's disappointing.
Why is that?
Because this passage is about Jesus rising from the grave and appearing to all these people and saying, go into all the world, and that's just...
But it's covered in other books.
It is.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, and there is a possibility
It's like
of these two things.
A story, though.
Here's
It's like,
here.
I don't like a story
You
without
lost the
a happy
paper.
ending.
I don't know if it's lost paper. Here's what I think is the most probable thing that happened, is that John Mark was the earliest gospel, and that means most likely the Apostle Peter was still alive when he wrote that. And I would think it would make perfect sense that if there was a gathering and John Mark was sharing his gospel verbally, like everybody, like sharing it out loud to everybody, and it could have been over a meal or something like this, around a table or something like that. And then he gets to verse 8, and everybody stands up and like, that's a horrible ending. And he's like, you're right. Let the Apostle Peter tell you what happened right now. And the Apostle Peter gets up, and then it's a beautiful place to share the gospel. It's a beautiful place to like share how their story ended. But the Apostle Peter can't live forever, so maybe that's why the Gospel of Matthew was ultimately written the way it was. If you do read Matthew 28 and you put it on top of Mark 16, it reads flawlessly. It reads just like perfect. And what I mean by that is in Mark 14, it says, don't worry, Jesus will meet you again after he rises again in Galilee. Guess what Mark 28 is all about? Jesus meeting the disciples again in Galilee after he's resurrected. And that's already what's kind of set up in Mark. So maybe Matthew just comes along and he's like, okay, the Apostle Peter can't keep doing this forever. We're going to need a Matthew 28. And then he also adds some other things like the Sermon on the Mount that's not in the Gospel of Mark. And he just fleshes some things out. That's all seems like a purposeful, intentional kind of thing. But we should be honest, most likely no apostles wrote what's in your Bible for Mark 16, 9 through 20. The manuscripts, the paper that shows up later is hundreds of years after the apostles were dead. So I do believe it should be read, but no apostles could have written it. So for someone who really cares about the apostles' message, if you ask me what the New Testament is, it's the apostles' message. Is Mark 16, 9 through 20 technically the apostles' message? But it doesn't necessarily contradict the apostles' message. It doesn't contradict the apostles' message. But we should be honest about that. That's a problem. And you should realize that some people will say, well, see, they did change the New Testament. Mark 16, 9 through 20 is the example of that. And I'd be like, you're right. They did add that. And you know what? We know all the places they did. And there's only 2 places that we really have to be worried about that. But don't ever fall for the fear trap that if they did add Mark 16, 9 through 20, then they could have added other parts. It could have been non-apostles adding other parts to the New Testament. No, one thing by being honest about Mark 16, 9 through 20 is that that's one of the places we know for a fact the apostles didn't write. And guess what? We know all the places where that's in question. So don't ever be scared like, oh, maybe there's other parts that the apostles didn't write. No, we know all the parts that are in question, and we just got to be honest about that.
Was it oral history or something? It could have just been.
Yeah, I mean, when John Mark was first sharing it in Rome, it was all just around the table telling the stories about Jesus.
And somebody remembers it later, so.
Possibly, or they added it later. Now we will never have the actual document evidence to prove one way or the other. But I think what you're saying, Tony, makes the most sense for the adultery, the woman caught in adultery thing.
Mm-hmm.
That was probably a love story. That was probably a true story about Jesus. And it was beloved. But the pieces of paper that show up with that passage, guess what they're saying? It's not in the oldest papers that we have. And so the apostles were dead by the time those pieces of paper show up with that story on it. Now, you're saying, the stories were told over and over again at suppers and table to table, and this had to be a beloved story. It is such a love story, even to this day. If you try to be honest with people and tell you like, well, it's probably not an apostolic writing, they're like, I don't care. I'm going to read it anyways, and I'm going to enjoy it because it's so loved. Most likely, that's because the early church loved it too, and they just did not want to let it die. But did the Apostle John write it? These guys say no.
He said it.
What?
He said it.
Did he write it? Yeah, I don't know. We just got to be honest with that. But by being honest with these two passages, guess what? That's the only passages. Those are the only passages that have ended up in your binding that may not be apostolic.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And we know that. And that is certainty because we have nerds in Bible colleges going over every preposition, over every conjunction. And we would find the other problem passages because people have been scouring it and all the little manuscripts, all the little scraps of paper for hundreds of years now. And we would know if there's other serious things we should be honest about. So, here's the final word, and we'll get you guys out of here. In the final analysis, this is Daniel Wallace, a doctor at Dallas Theological Seminary, one of the most conservative Christian Baptist-like seminaries you'll find in all of the land. He says, in the final analysis, no cardinal doctrine, no essential truth is affected by any viable variant in the surviving New Testament manuscripts. For example, the deity of Christ, his resurrection, his virginal conception, justification by faith, and the Trinity are not put in jeopardy at all because of any textual variation, but the prepositions are in trouble. The conjunctions are in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Confidence can therefore be placed in the providence of God in preserving the scriptures, except in two places you should be honest about. Even if you love those passages,
And it was just.
and you're like really sad, Mark 16:9-20 is
Read
not
Matthew.
written by John Mark, then yeah, read Matthew is what I do. I totally
Counteract it.
I totally put those two together. But do we have the New Testament Jews authorized? It's on the page. It's on the page. Just it's kind of a little puzzle for nerds to really figure out. Okay, which exact phrasing is Jesus's? It's on the page, but does it always end up without brackets or parentheses or little marks? No, not always.
Does this Daniel D. Wallace have a book? Is this based, is your stuff based on a paper or a book?
Good question. I'll find out for you.
Okay. I just was wondering if he had a book. He sounds like a cool person.
I'm sure he does.
Yeah, I'm sure. Oh, yeah. Because he's taught Greek at DTS for
Wow.
decades.
But this, I mean, what you're saying here, when these because Mormons will come to you and say, we believe the Bible insofar as he correctly translated.
Yeah, have you had
Like,
conversations with
that's a black
them?
hole. And I'm always wondering, how do you guys know? If you don't have the original text, you can't say it was or wasn't, but we have it.
Right, and we have 14,000 scraps of paper to compare and contrast. And so, yeah, always point them to the actual date when the manuscript started to change and be corrupted. Push them to the actual moment when the monks went rogue.
You mean ask them when?
Yeah, absolutely. Ask them when this
date?
happened.
When
And then
the
just
text?
go check their historical reliable authorities. And then they have the burden to show you where the manuscript tradition started to veer and really go wacko. And I can only find 2 places, and it's not even wacko, where like suddenly people are adding things to the scriptures. There is no other place, and it's just not a viable even option to discuss.
I like the idea that even non-Christian Greek scholars believe that our Bible is accurate.
Mm-hmm. They
Because-
believe it's on the page.
Yeah.
They believe somewhere on there is the words of the apostles, except in 2 places.
Mhm.
Well, all right, so you guys have been very patient with me. I'll pray and get you guys to lunch. So, Lord, thank you so much for giving us your message and giving us your word. And thank you that we can have conversations with other people, even Mormons, who want to really question whether or not we lost that message. And please just help us to solidify in our minds what's clear and what's unclear, and be able to put that in our own words for others who are really wondering about this question. Are the manuscripts messed up? So please just be with us. Please take care of us this week, and help us get to the holiday season. In Jesus' name, amen.
Get-
Get to the holiday season.
Yes.